Welcome to Growing in the Faith. You're probably used to seeing our messages as regular episodes. This isn't an episode, but a message I felt a burden to share in between our regular episodes. I was at an event recently and a prayer was made for hunger in our land to come to an end. Somehow, my mind went to Joseph in the Bible and how God used him to save a nation from hunger, a nation that didn't even know nor worship the true God. Yes, it's important for us to pray, especially against something as devastating as hunger. But in that moment, against the backdrop of Joseph's example in Egypt, I realized that if all we are doing is praying, then it's not enough. Please let me explain why. Joseph, a prisoner in Egypt, imprisoned for something he did not do, was used by God to save Egypt through a 7-year famine. His example shows us not only how he dealt with hunger in that land, but also the kind of men and women a nation needs to save it from its problems. Let's take a look at the kind of society Joseph lived in Egypt at that time. We don't know too much, but the little we know gives us enough of a picture. His master's wife propositioned him to sleep with her, the wife of a man of power. So clearly, immorality existed at the highest levels. Then she lied against him when he refused her advances, and he ended up in jail. Telling falsehoods against others has existed for a long time. The point is that Joseph did not live in a perfect environment. At least in these two respects, it was no different from our world today. But what about Joseph himself? This was a young man who was spiritually gifted. He could interpret dreams. But his gift did not operate in a vacuum. He was holy. He lived a blameless life in God's sight. He was tempted to sin by Potiphar's wife, but he chose not to. Living a blameless life is not about rules and regulations, but about your having a conscience that you desire to keep clear before God at all costs. Listen to what he said to Potiphar's wife. I read, "There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" He saw her proposition not as something to be enjoyed, but as wickedness, something evil, a sin against God. He had a conscience that was sensitive to doing anything wrong in God's eyes. This is important because being holy is not primarily just about not doing this or that, but living a life that accords with God's ways because we want to please Him. So, those who will lead and excel must first be holy as Joseph was. Society may have lost its bearing, and standards and morals may be at their lowest, but those who will be the ones to save a nation cannot operate morally at the level of the world around them. No. One thing we must understand is that no matter your level of gifting, excellence cannot be produced from unrighteous living. Joseph was extremely gifted, but he could do all he did because he lived righteously and was untainted in God's eyes. We are crying for those who will save our nation. Well, it is men and women who, in the face of corruption, are blameless in God's sight, like Joseph was. But Joseph's stand for righteousness came at a cost. He was in charge of his master's house, but he was still a slave. So the proposition from Mrs. Potiphar could have seemed attractive because he could have reasoned that she could be instrumental in getting him out of servitude, but he chose not to accept. A very high price for what seemed like the loss of a great opportunity. Also, by refusing her advances, he was daring to anger his master's wife and face the consequences, which he did. Are you ready to pay a price? Because your righteousness will be tested. For a man who was going to end up saving a nation, his standing for righteousness was not just part of his preparation, but it also signaled his qualification for leadership in God's eyes. We want our nation to change for the better. We want to see good things happening. But where are the Josephs? Those who are holy and are ready to pay a price to prove it. Those like Moses who are ready to turn their back on the world and all it has to offer. I read, he chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. He thought it was better to suffer for the sake of Christ than to own the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to his great reward. These are the kind of people who will save a nation. We cannot go the way of the world and expect to change our nation. Joseph was able to save a nation through a famine that lasted 7 years. He did this not just because he had a dream that it would happen, but because he was competent. He was able to plan and organize the logistics nationwide to set aside and store food for a nation that would soon be in need after its period of plenty. How did he do it? Pharaoh had had two dreams. He was troubled about what they meant, and no one could interpret them until his butler remembered Joseph, who had correctly interpreted his own dream when he was in prison. Standing before Pharaoh, Joseph explained that the meaning of the dreams was that there would be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. I read, indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them, 7 years of famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land. So the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe. This was a warning about what was to come. Those of us who are old enough will know we have had a period of plenty in this nation. But what did we do during that period? Did we do what Joseph did? If we did, we wouldn't be where we are now. Joseph's counsel to Pharaoh was the template for the effective management of Egypt's food resources, which successfully saw the country through the very difficult years of the famine. He said to Pharaoh, now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years, and let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine. In essence, the 7 years of plenty should cover and provide for the 7 years of famine. This is a principle that is applicable to life in general. Our season of abundance should provide for our season of scarcity. The fact is, life, for individuals and for nations too, is in seasons, and we are not always in abundance or plenty. If we are wise and disciplined enough to save and set aside something when we have seasons of abundance, then we will not have to suffer a lack of provision and sustenance when we enter a difficult season. This means that we should not consume all our resources simply because it's within our power to do so, but rather be disciplined in our consumption, because some of what we have now is for the future when we encounter lean times. This was Joseph's message to Egypt as a nation. The advice Joseph gave was specific and detailed. A wise and discerning man should be put in charge of the whole exercise. 1/5 of the annual produce should be saved and stored each year for the 7 years of plenty, and the saved food should then be a reserve for the 7 years of famine. This way, the country would head into the 7 years of famine in a strong and comfortable position in terms of national food security. I can imagine the logistics, the planning, and supervision required to gather 1/5 of the produce of Egypt each year for 7 years, considering the size of the produce and the storage arrangements that would have had to be made. It definitely required someone with ability to execute all this, especially in a time when there was no technology to facilitate things. One interesting thing was that Joseph stored in each city the food grown around that city. I read, Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. This meant food did not have to be transported long distances for storage, which was logistically important. This was excellent wisdom. There would also have been measures to ensure that each year's produce did not get spoiled over the years it would be stored. Also, there would have been arrangements to secure the storage locations, the manpower required to execute all these activities, and the supervision required at every level to make it a success. Successfully implementing this complex enterprise speaks to Joseph's leadership skills and his ability. This is the picture of the man who saved a nation. He was holy and he had great leadership ability. Where are the men and women who are going to save this nation? We need people who are not only truly living righteously, but are also extremely competent and have leadership ability. The combination of holiness and ability that Joseph's example teaches is non-negotiable. Either is not enough. Both are critical. A righteous person without competence may not be corrupt, but will lack the capacity required to effect change. A competent person, on the other hand, who is not living a holy life, has the ability but lacks the conscience and moral grounding to do what is right. Change starts with us. Our nation can be saved, but it's up to us to pay the price. We pray a lot, and I believe God has heard our prayers. But faith without works is dead. He's not going to come down to do for us that which He has put in our power to do. We must turn from our unrighteous ways so that righteousness can be enthroned in this nation. Men and women like Joseph, who are blameless and competent, must arise, and we must pray that they will have the opportunity to come to leadership, just as Pharaoh gave Joseph the opportunity, because it is through them that the change will come. This quest starts with us. If the believers in any nation will change and arise, they will be the catalyst for the change that nation needs. We can each be the Joseph that will save this nation. Will you arise and be like Joseph wherever God has called you? Thank you for listening, and God bless you. Please don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and turn on your post notifications. Thank you.